Dimensions in Revit not only show the measurement of objects within the file, but they also help modify those objects or modify the measurements between those objects, as well as can apply a constraint to the measurement of those objects. Before we get started on using dimensions in Revit, let's take a look at some of the terminology. In Chapter 11 on page 19 of your textbook, you will see this diagram. This is very helpful in knowing the terminology for dimensions, as well as using that terminology to apply the type parameters to make the dimension string look the way you want it to look. You can work your way around and notice that the dimension text is the actual text that shows the measurement. The dimension line here, which runs here between the tick mark and the tick mark, is the line that shows the actual measurement. The dimension line extension is the portion that extends past the tick mark. The witness line is the vertical line that extends from the point that you're measuring up past the dimension line. And the witness line gapped element is the space that you use to distinguish between the line of the dimension and the object that you're dimensioning. You can control these with the grips that are found here and here. And lastly, the lock, if you lock that, will keep the two objects that are being dimensioned consistently or constantly at the measurement that has been recorded. To begin looking at dimensions within Revit, we'll start with temporary dimensions. When you highlight an object on the project, for instance this wall, you will see blue dimensions show up on the screen. These are temporary dimensions. They show the relationships and the measurements of the object. To make a temporary dimension a permanent dimension, you can select this icon here. And you can see that it turned from blue to black. Now that will be printed if you were to print this sheet. The blue dimensions do not print. Once you have created a temporary dimension into a permanent dimension, you cannot get rid of that permanent dimension just by selecting it. You can see that that icon no longer exists. You can delete it and always put it back. The dimension in Revit not only shows the length or measurements of objects, but they can control the length or measurements of those objects. If I were to highlight this wall, you can see that that 10 feet is now blue. And remember, anything in blue in Revit means you can modify it. If I select on that 10 feet, I can type in a new dimension or length, and the wall will change. If the wall is not attached on either end, it will change from the center point of that wall or the object that you're measuring. If I select a wall that is connected on one end to another object and I change that dimension, it will change from the free end of that object. The last thing we'll discuss about temporary dimensions is if you happen to select more than one object. You'll notice by holding the Control key down, I can select more than one, but as soon as I have multiple objects selected, the temporary dimensions have disappeared. I can get them back by using this button up here, the Activate Dimensions. When I select that, you can see all the temporary dimensions show up that I can use by having both of these objects selected. If I select this wall and I make this dimension permanent, I can then select that dimension and lock that dimension. Now, whenever I move one wall, the other wall will stay at the 7'9" dimension because of this lock. This is a very helpful tool. If I don't want it constrained anymore, I can always highlight the dimension and unlock it. The same also holds true for a dimension that shows the length of a wall. If I lock that wall to 20 feet, and try to change it, Revit will not let me. Now let's take a look at actually placing dimensions. Here on the Annotate tab, Dimension panel, we'll see the different ways that we can apply dimensions. The first and most commonly used dimension tool is the Aligned. This will dimension objects that are aligned to each other. If I were to have two walls, I could also do an align dimension between this angled wall and the straight wall. Or I could dimension on the angle. The dimension aligns itself to the first object that you click on. The next type of dimension is the linear dimension. Please also note, as soon as I select one of the dimensions, the Modify Place Dimensions tab is created, and the dimension tools are now found on this side of the ribbon. The linear dimension tool dimensions things between their two shortest points, and it stays orthogonal to the screen. So if we select this point here and this point here, or rather this point here and this point here, it will not align itself to the angle of the wall, but in fact it'll dimension the horizontal distance between those 2 points. If I go from this point to this point, the shortest distance is actually a vertical dimension, and so therefore it makes the dimension vertically. The next dimension is angular. This dimension measures angles between objects. You can select one object and the next, and you will see the angle. When you click again, it'll place the dimension. The next type is a radial dimension. Let's create a circular wall for this. And this dimensions the radius of any arc. You can modify the arc by highlighting the wall and changing the radius. Create another circular wall to show the next dimension, which is the diameter dimension up here on the dimension panel. And it comes with the diameter sign. And the last type of dimension we'll take a look at is the arc length. If we select on this, you might want to refresh the order in which you need to pick things by looking down here. Revit is telling us to select an arc along which the dimension will measure the length. So we'll select this arc, and then we'll want to select the beginning of the arc and the ending of the arc. And now you can see how long that wall actually is. Now let's take a look at actually making the dimension strings look the way we want them to look. If you want to modify how these things look, you can highlight the dimension and go to the type properties. You can see by the drop-down menu that Revit already has several loaded by default. If we edit the type properties, you can look at all of the different graphics that you can change to make them look the way you want, including down here the text. If you scroll down, you can see you can change things like the font, the dimension of the size, and the offset of the text, and the width factor. I'm not going to go through all of these in this video, but please go through these and play with them, and you can see what difference it makes, and you can make the dimension string look the way you want it to look. One thing I will show us today is this section here, the centerline symbol, centerline pattern, and centerline tick mark. I modify this for my own personal projects. You can see on this dimension string that the dimension string at the wall is measuring from the center of the wall. Same with this one. Same with the window. I would normally move this end to the edge of the wall or the face of the wall. You can do this in two ways. The center grip here is a toggle. If you click this once, it'll move from the center to the face of the wall. If you click it again, it'll go to the other face of the wall. And if you click it one last time, it'll go back to the center. Again, I like to put it on the face. You can also grab this grip and move it to another object if the dimension line wasn't where you wanted it to begin with. And you can grab the bottom grip and change the distance from the object that the dimension string is. I'll go ahead and keep this one centered on this wall, as well as the window. As you can see right now, this dimension string makes no differentiation between a center line and something that's on the face. If we go back to the type properties and look at these centerline symbols, patterns, and tick marks, we can change that. We'll start with the centerline symbol here, and we'll add a centerline. We'll change the centerline pattern to an actual center line type. And lastly, the centerline tick mark will change to a dot filled. When we hit OK, you can see what it has done. And now we have a visual representation when the dimension string is measuring to a center line of an object versus when it is to the face. One thing I'll show you while we're here is if you highlight the dimension string, you can hover over it and tab and select each one that you're hovering over. If you do this, you can delete an interior dimension of a dimension string. It doesn't have to be the interior. You could select just the end and delete that one. And that is how you change the type parameters of a dimension string to make it look the way you wish. You can also modify the text of the dimension string. If you select the dimension string and then select the text, you get the dimension text dialog box. You can see by default it is using the actual value, in this case 8'1". You can replace this text with anything you want except for a false dimension. You cannot put in 12 feet because Revit does not want you to put in false information. However, you can say things like 8 feet 0 inches minimum. So instead of the actual dimension, it might be more important that this has to be at least 8 feet wide. If we go back to that dialog box, we could use the actual value, and we can type things above the text, before, after, or below the text. You might say above it, 8 feet minimum. You could say prefix, you could say anything you want, maybe the suffix, which is after the text, you could say clear, and below you could just type in, again, anything. And that is how you can add text to your dimension that stays with the dimension string. Once the dimension string is highlighted, again, you could lock it if you wanted to keep it at that 8'1". You can also use this grip if your text became too big to fit in between the two extension lines. You can grab this grip and pull the dimension string out, and Revit will create a leader for you. When placing dimensions on your project, there are several options that you can pick from to make the dimensioning process easier. If I'm going to select the Align dimension and look up here, I can see that I can pick if I want the dimensions to start with wall center lines, wall faces, center of core, or faces of the core. And that will be the first selection that Revit will hover over or select. You can always override that and find the center line of the wall by zooming in. But if you're always dimensioning to a wall face, you can change it here and it'll make dimensioning faster. You can also change the way you pick the objects between individual references, which we've been using all along in this video, or entire walls. If we pick entire walls, instead of picking an object and another object, you just pick the wall that you want to dimension. And it will dimension everything along the wall. You can change the different objects that it's actually going to pick through the options here. It is set to select everything: openings, intersecting walls, and intersecting grids. But if we wanted not to show the grids or the walls and just wanted to dimension the openings, we can do that as well. There are three basic types of dimension strings that you can use when dimensioning a project, and those are found in the type properties at the very top, called dimension string type. What I normally use is the continuous type, and that's what we've been using in this video. I have selected this dimension string here. If we change that to baseline, you can see that it starts a new dimension string for each object. If I highlight that again and go to the type properties, I can change it to the last type, which is ordinate. Hit OK. And now instead of dimensioning between the objects, this is dimensioning every object from the very beginning point. And the last tools from the dimension panel that we'll take a look at are the spot elevation, spot coordinate, and spot slope. We'll start with spot elevation, which shows you how high a surface is from the level while you're in floor plan view. To do this, I'm going to need to create some floors. I'll create a floor here, and this is right at level 1. I'll go ahead and create another floor, and this time I will offset it 1'6" above level 1, and I can put it here. And I'll do one more floor, and this one I'll set 3 feet above level 1. Now that I have these floors, it might be helpful in floor plan view to see the elevation of each surface. We can do that again from the Annotate tab, the Spot Elevation tool here, and as I hover over a surface, it'll show how high that surface is. This is very helpful, especially on stairs, showing how high the stairs go or at the landings of the stairs. Let's go ahead and take a look at the spot slope. For this, we'll need to add a roof or any sloping surface. A roof is just an easy one to illustrate. I'll go to my site plan view so we can see the entire roof. If I select the spot slope, as I hover over a sloping surface, Revit will show me the slope of that surface. It doesn't have to be in floor plan view. It can also be an elevation or section, anywhere where you actually see the slope. And lastly, we'll look at the spot coordinate. This displays the north and south and east and west coordinates of points in a project. And as you can see, if you place your object in the world, in reality, and we will look at that later in the semester, but there might be a specific point on your project that has to be lined up specifically at a latitude and longitude, and that is how you can show it.